Carrie Olaje. I am honored to have you on Unbroken. I've heard about you. I know you interviewed with Emma and with Sean from Wake the Dead, who I think is such a great guy. And I love to interview SRA survivors because I think it's really important that we all tell our stories because this is still being done to children today. And so I think by revealing what's happened to each of us, it's going to help expose this to the point that it stops. So welcome to Unbroken. I'm really glad to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Max. I'm really honored to be here. Like you're such a warrior in this space and in your own healing. It's really beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Well, let's start maybe with just, kind of how did you get into SRA? Just tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, so um I think with a lot of survivors, it's sometimes the case that we don't know necessarily how far back things went. Essentially, there's like a lot of history, it seems like, of trauma, and especially like really horrible like sexual abuse and psychopathy on both sides of my family, really. As far as I can tell, like the main way that I got into things is that my dad is a pedophile and a sociopath and everything, and he um, his favorite form of pornography was always snuff pornography, which I'm sure most of your viewers are familiar with. So, from an early age, I was exposed to that a lot, and I'm pretty sure that that's kind of like the main avenue that he got involved with the organized crime networks that he sold me into, basically. So, I was essentially sold to a handler at a really young age. My earliest memories are like 2 or 3, basically. It was a military family. Both my parents were in the army, basically, and I was essentially like sold to a handler that I was kind of like a really like loyalty bonded, romantic bonded, which is messed up to think of with like a toddler and everything from an early age. Like I said, really young, there was a lot of programming that was going on to really reinforce that bond basically, which I've talked about before. It's his name's Julius William Gates. So he was when I was born, he was actually Sergeant Major of the Army, and which is like the highest position you can have, like in that branch, basically something that's had for like about 3 years or so. So yeah, my earliest memories were really essentially being like trafficked through like medical abuse and stuff like that, and sexual abuse, both from my dad, who was a pedophile, as well as through kind of a more organized network, where there was, a lot of training and technology and stuff involved initially. And then we moved to Texas when I was about 3.5 or so. And then when I was 4, really the abuse like super escalated basically, to where there was a lot of time spent in like bunkers in that area, basically, where it was very like shock and awe, being separated from my family, which was pretty easy because my dad was totally complicit with it. And then my mom was in the military at the time too. So I had like sometimes, several months where she was off doing training out of state, and my dad had sole custody of me. And a lot of times, those times, basically, I wasn't even in his custody. I was like in the custody of, this organized crime network that was um, perpetrating a lot of like really horrible, just like torture and abuse and everything on myself, as well as other kids. That's one thing that I really like to point out is like a lot of my memories of being, trained and like trauma programmed, like was almost always in like groups, sometimes 3, 4, or 5, other kids that were also going through the same like really horrible experiences. And the main, the main goal of a lot of this stuff was, yes, the trafficking that I was used in a lot of child pornography, but it was also um, occult abuse. So I experienced a lot of like ritualized abuse where I was like forced to participate in rituals from an early age and start to be trained essentially into perpetration and everything at a young age, and violence. And that was both from the occult side of things, but then also in the, I don't know, like military operational, NWO style type stuff where there was a lot of parts essentially, I'm sure your viewers are familiar with, but a lot of parts that were essentially trained to sometimes have like very dehumanized, like animal type stuff where it's like we were forced to perpetrate a lot of violence on other kids, and were essentially like trained into understanding that we were supposed to be as part of like some like occult hierarchy basically, and what went along with that is usually the forced perpetration and stuff like that. So I was gonna say, yeah, healing from this stuff is really crazy because it's got a lot of layers to it for
Yeah.
sure, as far as like the things that I went through. But most of it was really to satisfy Gates and his, you know, fetishes and stuff. He really enjoyed um, having sex slaves that essentially he saw as like him or something like that. So it was very reinforced to me to be very like trained to be somewhat psychopathic in some of my own parts from a very young age, and to have a very like a lot of my other than the occult stuff, like a lot of like what I was trained to do was like ritual, like butchery and stuff like that. So being like forced to like participate in rituals in that way from a young age, like I said, it was, started around probably 4.5. Um, when I was 6, it like really like intensified all that training. And then by 7, I like had quote unquote graduated, like all of that kind of stuff, as in I'd survived it, I had been able to dissociate it, still live a somewhat normal life as a child, to where I was very high achieving in school, and very precocious, lots of talents, mainly art was like a big part of it, as well as like I don't know, just like academics type of stuff. And then when I was 7, I was essentially uh, my parents retired from the military, and we moved to Arizona, where I like kind of had like a new assignment or whatever, where I essentially was performing the role of like an occult um, channel slash like I was kind of trafficked to like a coven there, where like I was to like a head, I don't know what they call them, like a fucking warlock or black magician. I don't even know what to call them. It was all the ritual cult stuff that I was in was a very like druidic kind of earth religion based stuff. So most rituals for me happened outside, and were based around like that particular set of like holidays, and everything. But I had like a certain archetype I was supposed to embody from the occult side of the training. So I had kind of like a long term trafficking assignment with that side of things, where I was trafficked to a local coven and would perform rituals with them throughout the year. And he was actually my dad's boss, so like a hand surgeon. So it always made it seem like they had flown him out there to get the job, because he was like my father was I mean still an occupational therapist, so he's a lot of times worked like with post surgery type stuff. But this particular guy, was part of the same network essentially. But then also because my like kind of like mind MK Ultra mind control style training was continued in at a Davis Monthan Air Force Base, basically. And Gates didn't necessarily live in Arizona, but he would frequently come back, essentially, to either bring me to trafficking events that were like a little bit more high profile that he wanted to be a part of, where I was kind of in the role of being, I guess, like a child dominatrix is kind of where a lot of like the training went into. Lots of, really disgusting things and violence and bestiality and all the worst crap you can imagine, basically. But yeah, a lot of like the more mind control training was also perpetrated there, on that Air Force base. Um, so I pretty much was, had a front life where I was very like shy and academic and, you know, still being abused at home by my dad, with the incest and the snuff pornography and being exposed to a lot of that. And then had this kind of like, nighttime cult life or whatever, where essentially there was, I don't know, just, I mean, you've talked about it a lot before, there's just a lot of trauma involved, a lot of forced perpetration involved. Um, Up until really I was in college, basically. I had several times where I had kind of like little breakdowns and stuff like that where, I had a hard time performing the way they wanted me to, but they always knew, the right, screws to turn, the right like programming type shit to keep me somewhat together, for my front life. But by the time I was in college, I was really like breaking down a lot because of all of the stuff I had gone through, and ultimately because in my soul, in my heart, it's not never a place I ever wanted to be,
Yeah.
even though they use a lot of reward stuff to try and encourage those cult allied parts of you to want to be there. Um, so,
So let me ask you,
okay.
so real quick. Hi, I'm Max Lowen from Unbroken.Global. It is vital we all understand mind control in order to change our world. Every institution and government around the globe is using trauma-based mind control on humanity in order to control and enslave us. My upcoming seminar will break down the ways we are manipulated, starting with an understanding of our psyche, brain, and nervous system and how these are hijacked by those in power. I will explore the various manifestations of mind control, the use of fear, repetition, and trauma, as well as explore the ways we are programmed into a lower consciousness reality. The parasitic ruling class uses our light and creativity, manipulating us into co-creating a reality that serves them and is hostile to life and health. The good news is once we understand how our minds are being controlled, we become immune to manipulation and can begin to extricate ourselves from this controlled matrix reality that does not serve us. We can step into our true power and potential and come together to co-create a world that is abundant, balanced, high consciousness, and reflects our divine nature. We can remember who we truly are and use our creativity for the benefit of all life on our beautiful planet. We can free our minds and in so doing change our lives and our world. Wow, like just even what you've said, I just want to take a pause.
I know.
Um, you
Sorry, I get
know,
going.
no, it's okay. It is kind of astonishing how, I mean, I was also like a top student and actually very shy and withdrawn, but it's incredible that so many of us go through this degree of trauma, which would kill a lot of people just outright, and yet are high achievers. And it's so, I really want to emphasize the front life and the cult life because I think that's something that really confuses people because they don't get that part. So when you say that, what you mean, right, is like there's a life like the life I had where I went to the private schools and I went to the country. I had a very sort of upscale life because my family was political and lived in different countries. So there's like this life that you live that's normal, but then there's this whole other life that is torture and trafficking and rituals and all this crazy stuff. So to cope with that or to even be able to do it, we split into different parts, right? So that's what you're referring to. Like you had certain parts that were trained like to be a dominatrix and to do to be violent and to be probably like the beta sex kitten, right? So that's what they do. They have all these parts that they program. Are you good there?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. No,
My
no, it's okay.
son's asleep, so I was just realizing the volume was like a tiny bit loud, so I'm
Okay.
just
All
turning it
right.
down a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, and then, you mentioned snuff films, and I mean, some people might know what they are, but some people might not. And so, why don't you just describe briefly what a snuff film is for people who may not know?
Yeah, so the basics of it is just it's going to be a form of pornography. So usually, sex is going to be evolved in a certain level, but the I don't even know how to describe it to a lot of times to people. It's like, but like the main attraction, for the sociopaths that watch this shit is the violence that's involved. So usually there's going to be some sort of like maiming, you know, or killing basically of like the person that's, often child in my experience, sometimes animals, sometimes adults, but regardless, it's always characterized by um, someone like dying in a lot of times, in the act of the sex act, basically.
Yeah. The people who watch it are so completely psychopathic that they actually get off on watching the torture, the slow torture, dismemberment, and live murder of one or more people, usually children as well as
Mm-hmm.
animals. And that's the point. So they will always have expendable children to be used in those films, right? I mean, the average person would not even believe that that's a thing, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. And when you say Gates, you mean that military guy, right? That you referenced to as your handler?
Yeah.
Because all of a
Yeah.
sudden you said Gates, and I was like, Bill?
No.
Okay.
So
All right. Just wanted to clarify that.
yeah, that's why I try and say his full name in the,
Yeah, yeah,
in the beginning.
yeah,
It's just because, yeah, I often refer to him as Gates. It's like, I guess it's a military thing. You a lot of times just refer to people as by their last name. A lot of times that's like how I referred to him, other than, fucked up names like master or
master.
daddy or stuff like that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
No, exactly. But it yeah, so not to get confused
yeah,
with Bill Gates, but his name was Julius William Gates. So, who knows if there's relation there. I'm not sure.
yeah.
But yeah.
Okay. So when you were in college, the basically the programming started to break down, is
Yeah.
what you were
I
saying.
I had several times that it was breaking down kind of throughout my life. Like when I was really young, I remember them almost having to put in a lot of like anti-suicide kind of training and parts and stuff like that because as young as like 6 or 7, when I was kind of experiencing the most of stuff, I was already starting to like self-harm and stuff like that. So it's something that anytime I was outwardly starting to show the trauma, it happened again when I was like seventh grade, basically, that it's like there was kind of like another level of, I don't know, torture, programming, whatever you want to say, kind of like put on to kind of like, quash that stuff, make it more hidden and everything like that. Yeah, so when I was 18, I was going through kind of another situation like that where I was like even outwardly like just very dissociative, really depressed, and kind of like giving up on a lot of things in life, basically. And actually, that was part of like why my initial, even though the art had always been something that was like really valued with me because it was very like naturally talented in that area. Um, like the academics and the butchery side of things had always kind of like wanted them to put me in the position of a veterinary surgeon, was kind of like always like what had been pushed on me, but I was breaking down so much, and kind of having a lot of trouble like maintaining my academics, even though I got a scholarship to college, and all of that. It's like I was very apathetic and outwardly depressed and everything. So they really upped the, I don't know, the reward stuff, the loyalty stuff, and everything like that. But ultimately, um, at that point chose to shift my focus to just being in the art side of things because it was something that, the main
Being
concern was
naturally. Yeah.
yeah, and it's something that the main concern was that I was able to perform in the rituals. That was like the main thing, so um, it was kind of like a shift basically in the direction that like my front life basically took. So I went to school for art, but
So
about
you
two
were
years
still,
in.
so you were still being taken to rituals at that age.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I wanted to ask you, if you don't mind, just for a sec, a little deviation here about the coven.
Hmm.
So I think that's something that not that many people talk about, and I don't know if viewers understand that. I know that covens are actually pretty high up in the hierarchy, right? And
Hmm.
so these people basically they use black magic a lot. They love the full moon, the new moon, the solstices, the every astrological thing imaginable, certain special dates. And so a lot of what they do, there's a huge component of black magic, right? And there's covens all over the world. So I was wondering if you would mind describing a little bit more about the coven that you were part of, like so people understand what that is and what they do, if that's okay.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's totally fine. So I guess to kind of describe it and like my role in it, I have to go back to 3 years old, basically, when I was initially chosen for that role. I guess it's like whenever I dealt with the occult programming, it was always women. Some people kind of see them as like the Black Mother kind of thing where it's going to be women of various ages that are all involved in Black magic, basically. And I had a very early ritual when I was still living in Washington, D.C. That was there to like induct me as that being part of my life essentially. And it kind of went into the idea of channeling and like kind of like performing like the role of a certain archetype so that it's like they, whether this is BS or not, it's like they were intentionally trying to connect me with like a deity or like an entity, an outside, spiritual force, basically. That was where what I was meant to embody was kind of like black magic, like a connection to black magic, violence, basically the archetype of like kind of the huntress, essentially. So like Artemis was like the main name that was given to that part essentially. So it was a ritual that I went through where it was underneath Washington D.C. It was where I had essentially been I don't know how to describe it, like presented to like a crowd of people essentially that this was going to be my role. I was ritually uh, raped with like a golden phallus and then wrapped up like a mummy and then forced to watch as like three girls who were my same age basically were like seen as like this sacrifice for me, to be inducted, basically. And they were, raped to death on an altar. And then I subsequently, post that ritual, um, was taken to like a stone sarcophagus that had water in it, and then they put some blood in it as well. And I essentially was, kind of, they would dunk me in there to the edge of drowning, basically. And this is like where I'm like, I'm sure there's other girls that go through this and don't survive it. But I was like repeatedly like dunked, and then they would ask me questions, essentially, as they pulled me out, and screaming like a little kid normally would with something like this. And then they would throw me back in. But at a certain point, it's like, instead of behaving like a small child, like normally in this position, it's like I was able to, I don't know, dissociate, tap into whoever they wanted me to, and actually answer their questions, essentially. And that's kind of like the role. I don't even know if that makes sense to people, but that's the role that I continue to essentially play throughout my life in all of the different, um, and all of the different rituals that I was in. Typically, I was in the role of being the one to do the bloodletting of like the victims, or if not, I was in the role of essentially being like a ritual whore, essentially, where it's like the most of the rituals in Tucson with the coven that I was at were, like sex magic type stuff. So it would be, conducted by like the high priest or priestess. And then I would be at a certain point in the ritual, forced to perform a sacrifice. A lot of times it was animals. On occasion, for certain holidays, it was people, essentially. But then after that, it's like they would see almost like that I, was embodying that archetype that of that deity. And then I would be like ritually raped, and they would feel like that they were then like kind of like imbuing that power themselves, essentially. So it would be like Samhain, Childermass, St. Lucy's Day were several of like the big holidays, for me throughout the year, where a lot of times if I wasn't actually performing the sacrifice myself, I was there to just be kind of ritually raped by the people, um, usually multiple people in the coven, the high priest, and then there would usually be like several other people that would have, that role. A lot of times also I wasn't, especially during sex rituals, I wasn't the only one there. There were a lot of times other kids, that were also going through that, basically. But it would either be me performing violence or witnessing it, and then, being part of this. And what they felt like they got from it was either, there was one ritual a year where I would perform like the actual like channeling, basically, where they would, the culmination of the ritual would be all of this stuff, but then it would also be kind of like being forced into an altered state where they would essentially ask me questions. But a lot of times it was just like feeling like I was like a stand-in for the particular deity that they were interested in. And like I said, they were druidic, so that's like, pretty much all of them were, it's like nature worshippers, but not in the not in the positive sense that I think a lot of people would see. It's like they kind of more were very, they were very into like the violent side of nature, and almost like a very like anti-human kind of side of things, to where that was a lot of like what that part of me was like imbued with, was like a sense of like, human beings being, less than, you know the forces of nature, and that there was like a certain sense of like of, I don't know, I don't even know. Right.
Yeah.
um I don't know if that makes sense, but it was
Yeah, it
often,
does.
yeah.
It really does. I know I've seen, deliberate taking in of entities through rituals. So it's a thing that they do,
Hmm.
they and so you were kind of like an oracle or a channeler, which is a role that some girls are in. And yeah, it is. I mean, it sounds like a movie, right? It sounds
Hmm.
fantastic, but no, I know all of this really
Yeah,
well. So
yeah,
it it people would just not I think it's really hard to believe, but
yeah.
this is normal to them. And they do they do look down on humans. So I'm not
Hmm.
surprised you were in a pretty high role actually with the way you described it. So they have this way that they look down on humans because a lot of them at the higher levels aren't human, or they're hybrid with humans. So they consider themselves very special, right?
Yeah. I think that's a lot of like what in the programming that was for the cult allied altars, that's a lot of like what they tried to like give you a sense of, even from the earliest rituals, is that somehow you were like special or chosen, or like, that it was another layer of like dehumanizing your victims and setting you apart from them. And I guess that's the other thing that I would say is like sometimes I was used in non-druidic rituals and stuff because ultimately like most of my training from a young age was really about, you know, it's fucked up to say, but about performing sacrifice. So I knew a lot of like anatomy, animals, and people, and all of that kind of stuff. And like being able to be, I was trained to be able to be like, directed to perform a ritual a certain way. And I had a part, that was like a butcher that totally understood how to do that. So in a way, that's where I try and emphasize with people that it's like all of the fantastic stuff aside is like ultimately it's like it was just it was on a certain level, it was just organized crime and just trafficking, because there was so many people that I was involved with, different covens or different other occult workers that were kind of a little bit doing their own thing that didn't necessarily have the anatomical knowledge, didn't have like that kind of stuff. So I was kind of like, because I was trained in this way, I was kind of hired out to different
I
groups as
see.
well, to essentially perform, if they want to perform a ritual and they didn't have someone within their particular group that was trained and that knew how to do it, that, you know, I had a part that would, put on the costume that they were interested in and perform the role they were interested in, basically, and had, I don't know, that side of the knowledge, it gives kind of like a specialized skill set, basically.
Right.
And that's a lot of like what with Gates, a lot of what the trafficking really came down to is like, other than things that were just sex related, snuff related, with like the dominatrix side of things, with the rituals, it really was about him, putting me in different situations where it's like it was, a particular skill set that I was just like lending to the group, the
Yeah.
coven, whatever.
Wow. So, Carrie, how do you feel? Like, how do you hold that? I mean, that you did so much butchering and killing and all of that. Like, how has that affected you? How have you gotten through that?
Oh, that's a tough question. I mean, I think for a lot of survivors, they've been forced into perpetration on different levels, and I think that self-forgiveness really is a big part of it, and that's also, I mean, that's a part of why I was always so suicidal most of my life, is because it wasn't something I wanted to live with, and especially feeling like I didn't have any, when you're dealing with dissociation, feeling like I didn't have any um, really control over my life or parts of my mind and stuff like that, because they had been trained through a lot of torture from such a young age, and sometimes, technology, so like electroshock and harmonic type stuff, to really reinforce these really messed up roles. A lot of my life I lived in denial or depression, because of it. it's something that has always been the most difficult part of healing, with dealing with any of this stuff, has really been, um, I think it's why a lot of people that are involved with this stuff don't heal, because having to face these parts of ourselves, it's like I dealt with addiction for a lot of my life, a lot of things, that a lot of survivors do, suicidality, the addiction and all the different things that you do to try and like, cope and escape from your reality essentially. And I think that that's a lot of why I'm here essentially, not just here like alive, but also like here talking to you, doing the different testimonies that I have, like that essentially that's been part of my healing process and part of like the way that I cope essentially with all of the things that I was put through and forced to participate in is that it feels like so many of these victims that I saw what happened to them and like had my own part in it essentially that it's like I'm in telling my story, I'm telling their story. It's like a sense of they would never get justice. Their what happened to them would never be known. It's
Right.
like it's how I feel like I can. And you said it in the beginning too, like that this is something that continues to go on at a massive scale, and like that's the only way that I know how to
Honor them.
make it honor them, but also like make amends for like even though I know that I wasn't like fully conscious for these kinds of
Yeah.
things.
Well,
It's
it
like
wasn't your fault. It wasn't your
yeah,
fault
yeah.
at all. As a child, you had no choice. I was
Hmm.
forced to kill too. I had no choice.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me like the main because I think it's something that like is the most difficult thing to really like process for sure, but also to try and help other people to understand because it's going to be easy to either look at me like I'm crazy or like if I'm not crazy then I'm a total psychopath. It's just hard for people to understand. I think what we went through to push us to into these places. So it's like I always give like a small anecdote that was really instrumental in my training when I was being when the part when the Artemis part and the butcher part was really being solidified when I was like 6, basically that I had been kept in a kennel for like over a week, with various like torture and training. There was 2 other kids that were also going through this, but my training was a little bit more occult leaning with like a woman from the coven that like was younger and was in charge of most of the training of teaching. She was in the same role basically. She was older. She was like in her early 20s. I was like 6, but she had pretty much gone through all the same stuff and was now training me to like follow in her footsteps, basically.
Right.
But essentially, like I had, it was the point at which it wasn't, I was trained a lot on like cadavers or things that were dead already, basically, initially. And when it came to actually having to like kill an animal, is how it started essentially with me. There was a lot of resistance, even with all the trauma, with all the dissociation, all that kind of stuff. It's like I kept not being able to perform in the way that they wanted me to, essentially. And and I just remember that there was a time where essentially she ended up taking me to Gates and like explaining, that I, had been resisting, performing this role and everything. And it was kind of the thing that solidified a part of me that was able to then perform this stuff was that basically I was taken out to a campground that was near the kennel, which is in Texas, kind of remote central Texas outside of San Antonio area. And, there was a dog they had in a kennel and that they brought out essentially. And, she put the ritual knife in my hand, was like, kill the dog. And I was like, no, of course, it's like I was a 6-year old. I still had been resisting, and, her trying to convince me, Gates trying to intimidate me, yelling all the horrible things you can imagine saying to a kid. And I still didn't want to do it. So basically, he pulled the dog out of the kennel and put lighter fluid on it and set the dog on fire essentially, and let the dog run around for a while until it collapsed. And then once the dog was like, almost dead, then she put the knife in my hand again, walked me up to the dog, and was like, kill the dog, And it was like it's a memory I've talked about several times on podcasts and stuff like that, just because it really was like the main time that it was like that the part of me that would then become the butcher eventually, and become like this role in the cult essentially. It was kind of like the solidifying memory that really reinforced to me, to like a little kid, that like there wasn't any control, that the dog was going to die one way or another, that the victim was going to die one way or another. So would I like to do it quickly
Right.
and somewhat painlessly, or would I like to prolong and
Right.
intensify the suffering basically? So it was this point at which you realize that you didn't have any ability to like to do anything about, if they decided someone was going to die or something was going to die, that there wasn't anything that I could do about it other than try and make it as like merciful,
Right.
as possible essentially,
Yeah.
which
And
is,
that's
horrible,
how they
but
get us. But that's how they have gotten us.
mhm.
It's either threatening someone that you love and then they start to hurt them and there's no way out, or yeah, if you don't do it, then they're gonna make it worse on the victim. They're gonna make that victim suffer atrociously to punish us,
Yeah.
right? So at some point, there's no, you figure it, well, it's a mercy killing, I'll do it quickly, right? So no real human being, which you are and I am, can bear to hurt another life form. It's just
Mhm.
antithetical to who we are. It's to, we feel what the other feels. Like it's impossible. But these creatures that, have programmed us and abused us, they will actually use our love against us. They will use our compassion against us to force us into these situations. I mean, I'm so sorry. That is a horrific memory. I have a particular trigger with animals where like I cannot see animals suffer at all. I just freak out. So I mean, I can't imagine what you went through with that. I'm really sorry. I mean, not that every other thing you went through is not equally or more horrific, of course, but
Mhm.
yeah, but that's a really good story to illustrate how you hadn't, how you got forced into that role. So,
Yeah.
um, look, I know you probably have to go and I probably have to go. So maybe we'll wrap it up for today. But next, I'd love to have you back and I want to hear about like how you got out, how you recovered, how you healed, who you are today, because I think that part of it just shows the resilience of the human spirit and it's inspiring for people. Um, so in terms of just today, like, is there anything else you want to kind of share in part one here that you think is really important?
Oh my gosh. I mean, not really, other than just to just to emphasize, I guess, why we're having this conversation at all, is it just comes back to what you said in the beginning, in the intro, is that exposing this is kind of the most important thing, if we want to prevent more from happening and from continuing to happening. It was, from what I remember, was essentially like an assembly line of child trauma from what I saw and the number of victims I saw, and essentially that like it's not something that stopped. if anything, it's probably gotten worse or been become and that they're as horrific as it sounds, like that there's so many people that didn't make it either through because they were, either because they were killed or because they were so messed up and not able to regain like maintain their sanity to where, they're shells of human beings that
Yes.
are going to have a really hard time ever, getting out or healing or anything like that. So it really is like, you know, as horrible as the things that, you've talked about on your interviews, or myself or anything, it's like it it's part of how we get rid of the shame for one, and put it on the people that deserve it, the people that forced us into this, but it's also insanely necessary in the world just to continue to provide awareness and understanding to people that haven't had these experiences really on why it is like we need to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're really brave to share all the things that you've shared, and so many times I've heard people say, well, oh, but I can't hear about that. It's too much. Well, but I agree with you. People, you have to hear about it because they're still doing it to children right now. And,
Exactly.
so we have to care about that. And it's horrific. And the number of children is in the millions. This is not a small, isolated thing. This is global. And this
Yeah,
is
all over.
everywhere. Everywhere. It's a staple of the global cult. I mean, it's their primary thing that they do. Um, so thank you so much for sharing that. And I mean, it's hard to hear and it's hard but you think about, for people who say that, like, I think it was a little harder for us to actually live through it. Okay. So we lived through it. So it's just a testament to who you are that you're here today and that you're able to go on camera and talk about this. I really, really appreciate it, Carrie. And so let's do a part two and let's talk about how you got out and became the person that you are today, because today you have a good life like I do. Um, so we'll get together again soon and do that.
Yeah, I would love that. And I think that's almost as important as, the
Yes.
exposure is helping people to know who have been through this kind of stuff, that healing is possible.
Yes, yes. And if it's possible for me and you, it's possible for anyone. So absolutely. All right, Carrie. Well, then until next time.
Thank you, Max.
Thank you.